The wind in the Yukon has a sound unlike anywhere else on Earth. It howls through the frozen valleys, carrying with it the voices of old miners and forgotten dreams. For Parker Schnabel, that sound had become the soundtrack of his life. Each gust seemed to whisper the same question: how much more could he take? This season was supposed to be his biggest yet. Parker had the machines, the land, and the hunger to make it happen. But gold mining is a cruel teacher. It doesn't care how hard you work or how much you dream. It tests you, breaks you, and only rewards those who refuse to give up. Parker knew this better than anyone. What he didn't know was that this season would test him like never before, pushing him to the edge of total collapse before revealing a fortune that would change everything. The problems didn't come all at once. They crept in slowly, like cracks forming in the ice. The long hours, the freezing cold, and the endless pressure began to wear down the crew. These were tough men, the kind who could work 18 hours a day in snow and mud without complaining. But even the toughest men have limits. At first, it was small things: tools thrown down harder than usual, short tempers flaring in the mess hall, curses muttered under breath when Parker demanded more production. The signs were there, but when you're running a massive mining operation, it's easy to ignore the warning lights. Parker believed in pushing through. He believed that if you worked hard enough, the gold would come. But the gold wasn't coming, at least not fast enough. Each cleanout seemed smaller than the last. The numbers didn't lie, and the season was slipping away. Every week without good gold meant more money burned in fuel, parts, and wages. The pressure grew heavier with every passing day. Parker didn't just want to meet his goals, he needed to. The dream was big: 5,000 ounces. That was the target, and falling short wasn't an option. The crew, however, began to see things differently. What looked like determination to Parker looked like obsession to them. He pushed harder, worked them longer, and demanded more when they had nothing left to give. The Yukon cold cut through everything: gloves, coats, even spirits. The ground was frozen, the machines were breaking, and the men were exhausted. One morning, after another long, sleepless night, Parker looked around and saw something in his crew's faces that scared him. It wasn't anger. It wasn't even frustration. It was emptiness. They were burned out, running on fumes. The bond that held them together, the trust, the shared purpose, was beginning to crumble. The final straw came when everything seemed to break at once. A hydraulic hose burst, spraying hot fluid through the icy air. A pump seized up, choking the wash plant and flooding the pit with thick mud. The machines screamed, the men shouted, and Parker yelled orders over the chaos. But this time, no one listened. One of the crew members finally threw his helmet to the ground. "We're done," he said, his voice shaking but steady. "We're killing ourselves for nothing." The words hung in the air, heavy and final. Then one by one the others followed. Helmets hit the ground. Tools dropped. Without another word, they turned and walked away. The roar of the machines faded, replaced by the sound of boots crunching on frozen dirt and the low rumble of trucks driving off into the dark. Parker stood there in silence, watching the taillights disappear down the long access road. He was alone, surrounded by millions of dollars in equipment, but without a single man to run it. His dream operation had turned into a ghost mine overnight. The next morning, the camp was deathly quiet. The usual sounds of engines, laughter, and metal clanging were gone. Only the wind remained. Parker sat by the dying fire with the few men who had stayed, a small, loyal group who refused to abandon him even when everything looked hopeless. Running a mine that size with a full crew was hard enough. Running it with just a handful of men was almost impossible. Each silent minute cost thousands of dollars. Fuel bills piled up, machines sat idle,
and the clock kept ticking toward the end of the season. Parker's mind was racing. Most men would have packed up and left, calling it a loss. But he wasn't like most men. He spent hours poring over maps, geological surveys, and old reports. There was one place on the claim he couldn't stop thinking about. A section known as the Hollow Cut. It was an ugly piece of land, scarred and twisted from mining attempts decades ago. Everyone said there was no gold there. It had been tested, dug, and abandoned by miners long before Parker was even born. But something about it didn't sit right with him. He studied the maps again and again. He noticed small shifts in the bedrock lines, strange black sand indicators, and a depression in the earth that others had ignored. To him, it looked like the old miners had stopped just short of the real pay streak. It was a gamble, but it was also his only chance. When he told his remaining crew they were moving the wash plant to the Hollow Cut, they thought he had lost his mind. Moving a wash plant isn't easy. It's days of back-breaking work, and to move it to a place known for having no gold sounded like a desperate last act. But Parker didn't flinch. "We're doing it," he said. "Trust me." So they did. The men dismantled the massive wash plant piece by piece, their breath turning to clouds.
In the freezing air, the mood was grim. Every bolt tightened felt like another nail in the coffin of their season. They were following their boss into the unknown, hoping that somehow he saw something they didn't. When the wash plant was finally running again, the first loads of pay drift came from the shallow part of the Hollow Cut. It was terrible, mostly clay and gravel. No signs of gold. Days passed with almost nothing to show. The crew grew quieter with each cleanout. Doubt hung over the camp like a heavy fog. But Parker refused to give up. He told them to dig deeper. The deeper they went, the tougher the ground became. The clay turned black and heavy. Then, one day, as the excavator bucket bit into the earth, they noticed something strange. The material coming up looked darker, dense and streaked with fine black sand. Parker's eyes lit up. Black sand meant they were close. When they ran that dirt through the plant, something incredible happened. For the first time in weeks, there was gold. Not just tiny flakes, but thick, chunky nuggets glimmering under the lights of the sluice box. The men gasped. It was real. They had found it. Every few hours, they did another cleanout, and every time there was more gold than before. It was piling up fast, faster than anyone had ever seen on that claim. Their exhaustion turned into adrenaline. The camp came alive again, filled with laughter and disbelief. When they finally took all the gold to be weighed and assayed, the number left everyone speechless. The total value was over $30 million. No one could believe it. In a single stretch of ground that everyone else had written off, Parker had struck one of the richest gold finds in modern Klondike history. It was the kind of discovery that miners dream about and almost never see. The news spread across the Yukon like wildfire. Truckers, bush pilots, and rival miners all talked about it. The legend of the Hollow Cut was born, and word eventually reached the men who had walked out. Some were sitting in bars in Dawson City. Others were hundreds of miles away, already working different jobs. But when they heard that Parker had hit a $30 million jackpot, the truth hit them harder than any Yukon wind ever could. They had walked away from a fortune. One by one, they began to return. The first man to show up drove slowly into camp, head down, eyes full of regret. He didn't even know what to say. He just stood there, hat in hand, and muttered an apology. Soon, more followed. Some came out of shame. Others out of desperation. A few, though, came with a different attitude, expecting to be welcomed back and given credit for work they had abandoned. Parker listened to every man who returned. Some he forgave. Others he didn't. For those who were truly sorry, he gave them another chance. But it wasn't easy. They worked the hardest jobs, breaking rock in the cold mud,
earning back trust one long shift at a time. For those who came back with arrogance, expecting rewards after walking out, Parker's answer was silence. No yelling, no speeches, just a firm no. The rejected men left again, angry and bitter, their shame turning into resentment. But Parker had learned something important. Leadership isn't just about gold or machines. It's about people. And forgiveness sometimes is harder than striking gold. In the end, the hollow cut became a symbol of everything Parker had endured: the betrayal, the isolation, the impossible gamble, and the reward that came after refusing to quit. What started as a disaster had turned into one of the greatest mining stories in Yukon history. The same ground that broke his crew had made him a legend. Some call it luck, others call it skill. But maybe it was something else. Maybe the gold was waiting all along, testing Parker to see if he truly had what it takes to claim it. Because in the Yukon, gold doesn't just come to those who dig. It comes to those who believe, even when everyone else walks away.
Back-breaking work meant something. For weeks, they worked around the clock. The floodlights lit up the claim through the long Yukon nights, painting the snow and mud in shades of gold and steel. The machines never stopped. The roar of engines, the rattle of gravel, and the rush of water through the sluice boxes became a constant song, a song of redemption. Parker barely slept. He moved between machines, checking every load, every clean-out, every glimmer of gold. The exhaustion that had once dragged him down now seemed to fuel him. This was his moment, and he wasn't going to waste it. He had risked everything: his money, his reputation, his friendships, on a gut feeling. And that feeling had led him straight to a $30 million jackpot. But success, especially in the Yukon, comes with a strange kind of silence after the shouting dies down. When the excitement faded, Parker sat alone in his trailer, staring at the pile of gold stacked neatly in front of him. It was more money than most people would see in 10 lifetimes. Yet there was an emptiness that no amount of gold could fill. He thought of the men who had left, the ones who had once stood shoulder to shoulder with him in the freezing dark. He replayed that moment, the helmets hitting the ground, the sound of boots walking away. It was a moment burned into his memory, a scar that even $30 million couldn't erase. The Yukon teaches hard lessons, and one of them is that gold can't buy loyalty. It can't buy trust. And once those things are gone, they're nearly impossible to get back. The first man who came back to the claim after the walkout arrived just before sunrise. The light was faint, barely touching the snow-dusted hills. His truck rolled slowly up the muddy road, tires crunching through the frozen ground. When he stepped out, Parker recognized him immediately. They had worked together for years. The man looked thinner, older, as if regret itself had aged him. He didn't try to make excuses. He just stood there, eyes down, and said softly, "I messed up, Parker. I shouldn't have left." For a long moment, Parker said nothing. He just stared at him, the cold air turning their breath into mist. Then he nodded once and said, "Grab your gear. You can help with the next clean-out." It wasn't forgiveness, not really. It was a test. Over the next few days,
more familiar faces appeared, one by one, two by two. Some couldn't look Parker in the eye. Others tried to laugh it off, pretending nothing had happened. A few came back angry, insisting they deserved a cut of the gold because they had been there from the start. Parker handled each one differently. To those who came back humble, he offered a second chance. To those who came back proud, he offered the door. He didn't yell or argue. He didn't need to. His silence spoke louder than words. The ones who were allowed to stay worked harder than ever before. They carried a quiet shame, but also a deep respect for the man they had once doubted. They knew now that Parker's drive hadn't been madness. It had been vision. Every swing of a pickaxe, every shovel of frozen dirt was a way of saying, "I'm sorry." And for Parker, watching them work was bittersweet. He didn't gloat, didn't remind them of the moment they'd walked away. He didn't need to. The gold spoke for him. But outside the camp, not everyone was happy about Parker's success. Rumors spread through the Yukon faster than any radio signal. Other miners talked in bars, shaking their heads in disbelief. Some said Parker had stumbled on the richest pay streak in decades. Others claimed he'd found an old lost channel of gold that had been hidden beneath the hollow cut for over a century. With every retelling, the story grew. By the time it reached the far corners of the mining camps, the $30 million find had become legend. And with legends comes envy. There were whispers that rival miners wanted to know exactly where the hollow cut was. Some wanted to buy it out from under him. Others wanted to sabotage his claim. Parker had to tighten security, posting night shifts to keep an eye on the equipment.
He knew that gold this rich didn't just attract miners, it attracted trouble. But even with all the attention, Parker stayed focused. He knew that this discovery wasn't just luck. It was proof that instincts, hard work, and a refusal to quit could still beat the odds. The Yukon has always rewarded the stubborn. One evening, after another long day of hauling pay dirt, Parker gathered his small crew around a campfire. The night was bitterly cold, and the flames flickered in the wind. The men were tired, but there was peace in their faces now, something they hadn't felt in a long time. Parker looked at the glowing coals for a long while before speaking. "You know," he said quietly, "when you guys left, I thought that was it. I thought it was over. But sometimes you have to lose everything to see what really matters. The gold's great, sure, but this," he gestured around at the men sitting beside him, "this is what keeps it going. Without people who believe, it's just dirt." The men nodded silently. The crackle of the fire was the only sound for a long time. Later that night, as Parker walked back to his trailer, he stopped and looked over the hollow cut. The floodlights reflected off the icy ground, and in the distance he could still see the wash plant running. That hum, that steady mechanical heartbeat, was the sound of survival. The $30 million jackpot wasn't just money. It was the story of endurance, faith, and redemption. It was proof that sometimes the worst moments in life lead you to your greatest wins. But the story didn't end there. A few weeks after the big discovery, the same men who had been turned away, the ones who came back demanding their share, started showing up again, this time angry. They had heard how much gold had been pulled from the claim and wanted their cut. They argued that they had worked that ground before walking out, that they had helped make it possible. Parker listened patiently, his face calm. When they finished, he simply said, "You walked away before the gold came. You didn't believe.
Your choice." His words cut through the cold like a knife. There was no shouting, no insults, just truth. Some of them left in silence, others cursed under their breath as they drove off, but deep down, they knew he was right. In the Yukon, quitting at the wrong time can cost you everything. The remaining crew worked with renewed pride. They had stayed, they had endured, and now they were part of something that would be remembered for years. As the season came to an end, the snow started falling again, soft, white, and endless. The machines were shut down, the pay dirt was finished, and the gold was safely stored. Parker stood on the edge of the hollow cut, the cold wind whipping through his jacket, and watched as the last rays of sunlight glowed over the valley. This was where everything had fallen apart and where everything had come together again. He thought back to his grandfather, who had taught him that mining wasn't about luck. It was about perseverance. It was about believing when no one else did. And now, standing over the richest ground he'd ever mined,
Parker finally understood what those old-timers meant when they said the earth gives up its gold only to those who earn it. He had earned it, every ounce.
About striking gold. It was a story about never walking away, even when everyone else does. Because in the Yukon, the gold doesn't reveal itself to those who dig the deepest. It reveals itself to those who refuse to stop. And for Parker Schnabel, that $30 million find was more than just a jackpot. It was a lesson written in frozen ground, sealed in gold, and earned through every ounce of faith he had left. As the Yukon winter deepened, the hollow cut became both a symbol of glory and a quiet reminder of what it had cost. Snow blanketed the machines, softening the noise of the camp. The roar of engines was replaced by the hum of heaters and the crunch of boots on frozen ground. The excitement of the gold strike had faded into something deeper, a quiet pride mixed with exhaustion and reflection. The small crew that had stayed through the worst days now felt like a family. They had fought the cold, the hunger, the doubts, and each other. Now they shared something unbreakable. Whenever they looked at the piles of gold stacked in containers, they didn't just see money. They saw proof of their survival. Parker spent his mornings walking the claim alone. He liked to watch the sun creep over the white hills, throwing long shadows across the frozen mud. Sometimes he stopped to touch the cold metal of the excavator, remembering the nights when he thought the whole operation would collapse. Those machines had been silent once, just as he had stood silent, watching his crew drive away. Now, they stood as monuments to everything he had endured. One afternoon, as the light faded and the sky turned gray, Parker sat in the small office trailer, surrounded by paperwork and reports. The weight of leadership pressed heavily on his shoulders. He wasn't just a miner anymore. He was running an empire of dirt, diesel, and dreams. The $30 million find had changed everything, but it also made everything harder. Expectations grew, pressure increased. Everyone wanted a piece of him, from investors to rivals to the men who once doubted him. A knock came at the door. It was one of the men who had stayed.
An older miner named Dale. His face was weathered, his beard streaked with frost. "You all right, boss?" Dale asked. Parker looked up from his desk and forced a tired smile. "Yeah, just thinking about what's next." Dale nodded, stepping inside and glancing at the gold reports on the table. "Hard to believe, huh? All that from a piece of ground everyone said was worthless." Parker leaned back in his chair. "Yeah, guess the ground had other plans." The two men shared a quiet laugh. Then Dale said something that stuck with Parker for a long time. "You know, Parker, gold's funny. It's not just metal. It's a mirror. It shows you who you are, the good and the bad. This place showed us both." After Dale left, Parker sat there, staring at the maps spread across the desk. The Yukon wasn't just land to him anymore. It was a living, breathing test, one that measured how much a person could take before breaking. And yet, it also had a way of rewarding those who asked quietly. Parker didn't answer right away. He stared into the flames, thinking of the trucks that had shown up uninvited, the strange tire tracks found near camp, the whispers in Dawson City about people looking for the exact coordinates of the hollow cut. Finally, he said, "They might, but they'll find out real quick the Yukon doesn't hand over its secrets twice." Brennan chuckled. "You're not wrong about that." The three men sat in silence after that, listening to the fire crackle. Outside, the temperature dropped below freezing, and the stars burned bright against the black sky. The next morning, Parker received a message that one of the